The lock changed at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know, because I was staring at the security camera feed on my phone when the locksmith's van pulled into my parents' driveway, and I watched my mother point at the front door like she was directing traffic. I just finished a deposition. I was still in the conference room of a hotel in Charlotte, my laptop open, my hands smelling like the bad coffee they put out for witnesses. My assistant had texted me a heart emoji because the deposition had gone well. I remember looking at that little red heart and then looking at the camera feed and feeling absolutely nothing for about 4 seconds. Then I felt everything at once. My name is Ren. I'm 31 years old. I have lived in my parents' house in my old childhood bedroom for the past 18 months. People always assume that means I failed at something, a divorce, a layoff, a bad year. The truth is more complicated, and the truth is the only reason any of this happened the way it did. My grandmother died in October of the year before. She was the one person in my family who ever looked at me like I was a whole person and not a problem to be managed. She raised me on weekends because my parents couldn't be bothered. She taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 12 because she said women who don't understand money end up in trouble. She left me her house in Asheville, her stock portfolio, and a letter. The letter said, "Your father has been stealing from me for 6 years. I want you to find out how. I want you to make sure he never does this to anyone else." So I came home. I told my parents I'd been laid off and needed a place to land. I told them I was working remote freelance, nothing serious. I let my mother feel sorry for me in that performative way she liked. Rishi could tell her book club she was taking care of her grown daughter, and I started looking through everything. The mail, the bank statements they left on the kitchen counter, the way my father's accounting business had quietly absorbed my grandmother's investment accounts in 2019. What my parents didn't know, what nobody in that house knew, was that I had passed the bar 9 years earlier, that I had spent the last 6 years of my career as a forensic financial investigator at a firm that handled bank fraud cases and SEC violations, that I had made partner 2 years ago, that I owned a house in Charleston with a backyard pool, that my actual income, the year my grandmother died, was just a hair over $400,000. They thought I was a failed paralegal who couldn't keep an apartment. I let them think that. I needed them to think that. The morning of the lockout, my younger sister had called me at 7:14 a.m. to tell me she was moving in, not asking, telling. She said her boyfriend had cheated on her and she needed her old room back. I said her old room had been my grandmother's sewing room and was now full of boxes. She laughed. Actually laughed, like I'd told a joke. She said, "No, I mean your room. Mom and Dad already said, you can sleep in the basement until you figure something out." I'd said, very carefully, "I'm in Charlotte for work until Wednesday." She'd said, "Okay, well, the movers are coming today, so..." And then she hung up. I sat in the hotel conference room and I watched the security feed. I had installed those cameras myself, the week I moved in, telling my parents it was for the neighborhood watch group. My mother had been delighted because the woman next door had a Ring doorbell and my mother could not be outdone. The locksmith finished at 12:23. My father came out and shook his hand. My mother stood in the doorway in her good cardigan, the one she wore when she wanted to feel like a woman who had her life together. My sister's car pulled up at 1005 with a U-Haul behind it. I watched 2 men I'd never seen before carry my furniture to the curb. My grandmother's writing desk, the bookshelves my college boyfriend had built, the reading chair I'd bought myself for my 30th birthday. They put it all on the lawn, like garbage day. My mother actually went out and rearranged it so it would look more presentable from the street. I called my father. He didn't pick up. I called my mother. She picked up on the 4th ring and said, "Honey, it's not a good time." I said, "What's happening to my things?" There was a long pause. Then she said, in her saddest, most reasonable voice, "Sweetheart, your sister needs us right now. You're an adult. You have options. We can't keep enabling you." Enabling. I almost laughed. I said, "Mom, where are my things going?" She said, "We put them out front. If you want to come pick them up before tomorrow, that would be ideal." Then she paused and added, "Your father said to tell you that you can go live in the streets if you want to be ungrateful about it." She said it like she was passing along a recipe. I told her I'd be there Wednesday. I hung up. I sat in that conference room for about 20 minutes without moving. The light through the hotel window kept changing as clouds went by. I remember thinking, very clearly, okay, now we begin. I drove back to Asheville that night, not to the house, to a Hampton Inn off the interstate. I checked in under my own name for the first time in a year and a half. The desk clerk asked if I was traveling for business, and I said yes, and that turned out to be the truest thing I'd said in months. Up in the room, I unpacked my work bag on the desk. I put my laptop down. I plugged in my second monitor. I lined up my legal pads the way I do when I'm about to take something apart. Then, I ordered a club sandwich from room service and I started making a list. The first thing I needed to know was what was missing. I drove past the house at midnight. The curb was empty. They'd moved my furniture somewhere, or they'd let people take it. I drove to my grandmother's old storage unit, the one in her name that I'd quietly transferred to mine after the funeral, and I sat in the parking lot for a while. I called the storage facility's after-hours line and confirmed the unit was still secure. It was. Good. That was where most of what mattered actually lived. The boxes I'd been moving over slowly for months. My grandmother's documents. The hard copies of every bank statement and tax return I'd flagged. My passport. My real laptop, the one with the encrypted drive. My grandmother's letter. The decoy laptop, the one that had been on my desk in my old bedroom, was a $500 Best Buy refurb with nothing on it but a dummy email account and some Word documents I'd written specifically for someone else to find. If my parents had taken it, fine. If they pawned it, even better. I just need a receipt. The next morning, I called my office. I told my managing partner I was taking a leave. He said, "Family stuff?" And I said yes, and he laughed because he'd been telling me for months I needed to take a break. I told him not exactly a break. He said, "Ren, do you need anything from us?" I said I'd need an investigator licensed in North Carolina and someone in our white-collar group who didn't mind doing me a personal favor. He said he'd have names by the end of the day. By 10 a.m., I was in the parking lot of a pawn shop on the south side of town, watching my father walk in with a duffel bag. I had a pretty good idea what was in it. He came out 14 minutes later with cash. I let him drive away. Then, I went inside. The man behind the counter was a middle-aged guy with a kind face and tired eyes. I showed him my ID. I asked if he'd taken in a Dell laptop, an iPad, a pair of pearl earrings, and a Tag Heuer watch in the last 15 minutes. His face did this thing where he tried to be neutral and failed. He said yes. I asked if he'd taken in any jewelry over the last 6 months under the name of a man who looked like the man who'd just left. He went very still. I told him he wasn't in trouble and I wasn't a cop, but I was an attorney and the items being pawned were stolen, and I would like to buy them back, all of them, today. And I would like a printed history of every transaction this man had done at this shop, and I would pay for that history with cash and a tip. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Ma'am, I have been waiting for someone to come in and ask me that for about 5 months. It turned out my father had been pawning my grandmother's jeweler piece by piece since the spring before she died. I bought everything back. I paid him $1,000 for the printed history. I put it all in a banker's box in the passenger seat of my car, and I drove to a coffee shop and I sat in the parking lot and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not loud crying, just the kind where your face leaks while you stare at the dashboard. Then I called the investigator my partner had connected me with. Her name was Margot, and she'd done 20 years at the bureau before going private. I told her what I had. She said, "Sweetheart, this is Tuesday. By Friday, I'll have your father's whole life on a thumb drive." I went back to the hotel. I plugged in my real laptop. I opened my grandmother's file. Here is what I already knew. For 6 years, my father had been moving money out of accounts he managed for my grandmother. Not big amounts. 3,000 here, 11,000 there. He'd done it under the cover of investment fees and advisory charges through a small accounting practice. By my count, he'd taken about $312,000 from her. Some of it had gone to pay down his mortgage. Some of it had gone to my sister's wedding 3 years ago, the one where my mother ordered a chocolate fountain that cost more than my first car. Some of it had gone to a timeshare in Hilton Head. None of them could actually afford. What I didn't know yet, but what I was about to find out, was that my father had been getting greedier in the last 12 months. He'd applied for a small business loan in March, and on the application he had listed me as a co-borrower. He had used my name, my social security number, and a forged version of my signature. He had told the bank I was the chief compliance officer of his firm, which I was not, and that I made $240,000 a year working for him, which I did not. He had used those numbers to qualify for an SBA-backed loan of $190,000. He had not told me. He had not told my mother. He had been making the payments out of an account my grandmother had funded. When my grandmother died, that funding stream dried up. The loan was now in arrears. In other words, my father had committed bank fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft against me on a federal loan application, and he had been quietly hoping I would never find out. And his plan for keeping me in the dark had been to keep me dependent, to make sure I stayed in that house, defeated and small, where he could control what I saw. And then he and my mother and my sister had decided to throw me out. I want to tell you something about the moment I understood the full picture. I was sitting on a hotel bed eating a sad little salad from the gas station, and I had 3 browser tabs open and a notepad covered in numbers, and I felt this huge wave of grief. Not for myself, for my grandmother, because she had spent the last 6 years of her life being slowly robbed by her own son-in-law, and she had known and she had not been able to stop him, and she had used her last good months to write a letter to me. To the granddaughter she had quietly believed in. I closed my laptop. I called my managing partner. I said, "I need to take this all the way." He said, "Are you sure? Family is family." I said, "He stole from a dying woman. He used my name on a federal document. He threw my furniture on the lawn while I was at work. He told my mother to tell me to go live in the streets." He said, "Okay, send me everything by Sunday." I want to be honest about what came next because it didn't happen all at once and it wasn't clean. For 2 weeks, I let them think they had won. I didn't call, I didn't go by the house. My sister moved into my room and posted a picture on Instagram of her drinking wine in my reading chair, which she had apparently rescued from the lawn. The caption was "New Chapter." My mother liked the post. My father didn't, because my father didn't use Instagram, but my father did call me on day 6. He left a voicemail that was almost charming, in which he said he hoped I was landing on my feet and that he and my mother had made some hard decisions, but that they loved me and the door was always open if I came back ready to contribute. I saved that voicemail. I have it backed up in 3 places. While they were enjoying their victory, I was working 16-hour days. Margot, the investigator, found everything I needed and more. She found the email chain between my father and his loan officer, including the email where he attached the forged version of my signature. She found the wire transfers. She found a second forged document on a different application. She found a side account at a credit union my mother had no idea existed, with about $40,000 in it, which was where my father had been quietly stashing the cash from the pawn shop and the skim from my grandmother's accounts. The white-collar attorney from my firm, a man I will simply call my colleague, walked me through how to package it. We did not go to the FBI yet. We did not go to the SBA yet. First, we built the trap. I had my colleague set up a new entity. Just a clean little shell company, registered in Delaware, with a generic website and a phone number that rang to a service. We called it Heron Crest Capital. The website said we were a private equity firm specializing in small business turnarounds. It looked exactly as boring and legitimate as 1,000 other firms on the internet. Then I had Margot, who has a gift for these things, leak word through a mutual contact that Heron Crest was looking to invest in struggling family-owned accounting practices in the Southeast. Specifically, ones with strong client relationships but cash flow issues. The contact, who knew my father from the Rotary Club, mentioned it to him at a breakfast. My father called Heron Crest within 48 hours. He spoke to a woman named Tess, who was actually Margot doing a voice. He told Tess his firm was a perfect candidate. He told Tess he had recently expanded with a new office and was looking for growth capital. He did not mention the SBA loan he was already in default on. He did not mention the lien against his business that had been quietly filed 2 weeks earlier. He did not mention that his wife and daughter had recently thrown his other daughter out of the house. He told Tess he was a family man with strong values. Margot recorded all of it. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. The recordings were legal. We didn't even need them for the criminal case, but we wanted them for leverage. I'm going to skip ahead a little because the next part took 5 weeks and was mostly me sitting in offices. We turned the file over to the U.S. Attorney's Office on a Monday in mid-December. By Wednesday, the FBI's white-collar squad in Charlotte had it. By Friday, the SBA's Office of Inspector General had been looped in. The agent assigned to it, a woman with a flat affect and the most organized desk I've ever seen, walked me through the timeline twice. At the end, she said, "Counselor, this is one of the cleaner packages I've ever received." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Thank whoever taught you how to keep records." I drove to the cemetery the next day and put a coffee on my grandmother's headstone because that's what she used to do when she wanted to talk to her own mother. I sat there for a while. I told her we were close. I told her I missed her. I told her I was sorry it had taken me this long. The wind was cold and I could see my breath. After a while, I drove back to the hotel and I went back to work. The week before Christmas, I made one final move. I bought the house. This part is going to sound like fiction and I promise it isn't. My father had refinanced the family home in 2021 to cover some of his debts, and he'd done it through a regional lender that, in 2024, had been quietly acquired by a larger holding company. That larger holding company had a portfolio of distressed mortgages it sold to qualified investors. Heron Crest Capital, my little shell company, qualified. I bought the note of my parents' mortgage for 58 cents on the dollar. The whole thing took 6 business days and my colleague did most of the paperwork. By the time my parents sat down to Christmas dinner, the entity that owned their mortgage was an LLC owned by an LLC owned by me. They had no idea. They had not missed a payment technically, although they were 2 weeks late on the November payment because my father's cash flow was a disaster. Under the terms of the mortgage, the noteholder had certain rights when payments became late, including the right to begin foreclosure proceedings after 60 days. I was not going to foreclose. I was going to do something else. On December 28th, the FBI executed a search warrant in my father's office. They took every computer and every paper file. My mother called me 31 times in 2 hours. I let it go to voicemail. On December 29th, my father was arrested on charges of bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and making false statements on a federal loan application. The aggravated identity theft charge is the one that matters. It carries a mandatory minimum of 2 years on top of whatever else he gets. The U.S. Attorney's Office added a charge for elder financial abuse based on what he had done to my grandmother, with the documentation I had spent 3 years quietly assembling. My mother called me 47 times that day. I answered on the 48th. She was crying. Not the performance crying, the real kind. She said, "Ren, please, you have to help us. Your father didn't do any of this. This is a misunderstanding." I said, "Mom, I have his emails. I have the pawn shop records. I have the recordings. I'm not going to help him." She said, "You're our daughter." I said, "I was your daughter when you put my furniture on the lawn." There was a long silence. Then she said, "Where are you?" I said, "In a hotel." "Where you sent me." She said, "Your sister told me you were being dramatic." I said, "Was I?" She didn't answer. A week later, my sister called. She didn't cry. She yelled. She said I had ruined the family, that I was a vindictive psychopath, that everyone always knew I was the cold one. I let her go for about 4 minutes. Then I said, "You posted a picture in my chair. You called it a new chapter." I hung up. The morning of January 14th, I drove to the house I now technically owned. I parked at the curb. I sat in the car for a few minutes and I looked at the porch where my grandmother used to read in the summer before my parents moved in and made everything beige. Then I got out. My mother answered the door. She was wearing the cardigan. Her face went through about 6 expressions in 2 seconds. I said, "I'd like to come in." She let me in. The house was a mess. There were boxes in the hallway. My father, out on bond, was sitting at the kitchen table and he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. My sister was on the couch. She did not stand up. I sat down at the kitchen table across from my father. I set a folder in front of him. I said, "I'm going to explain a few things." I told them I owned the mortgage. I told them I had bought the note in December. I told them I was not going to foreclose because I am not actually cruel, but that I was going to be the landlord they would now be paying every month, and the rent, going forward, would be set at fair market value. I told them my mother could remain in the house if she chose to. I told them my father, depending on the outcome of his trial, would be living somewhere else regardless. I told them my sister had 30 days to vacate. My sister said, "You can't do that." I said, "I can. I have." My mother said, "Ren, we're family." I said, "Mom, I'm aware." I told them I was not pressing additional charges over my own laptop and the pawned items even though I could have. I told them I was not suing in civil court for the identity theft even though I was going to win that case in my sleep. I told them my grandmother's stolen money would be addressed in the federal restitution order, which I was prepared to pursue to the last dollar. I told my mother that if she wanted to repair our relationship ever, she had a long road ahead of her, and it started with sitting in a chair across from a therapist, alone, without my father or my sister, and figuring out who she was when nobody was telling her what to think. I told her I loved her, which was true in the way that things can stay true even when they have become very small. I told my sister nothing. I had nothing left to say to her. I left the folder on the table. Inside were copies of the deed, the loan transfer documents, a tenant rights summary, and a printed-out screenshot of her Instagram post in my chair. I had not added a note. I didn't need to. My father walked me to the door. He didn't speak until I was on the porch. Then he said, "You always were the smart one." I said, "I always was." I drove back to my real house, the one in Charleston with the pool, that night. I had not been home in 3 months. The house had that closed-up smell. I opened the windows. I made myself a real dinner for the first time in what felt like a year. I sat on the back porch with a glass of my grandmother's good bourbon, and I watched the sky go dark over the live oaks. My father pleaded out in March. He got 51 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a restitution order of $640,000, most of which will never be collected because he has nothing. The restitution that did get collected went to me on behalf of my grandmother's estate. I donated all of it to a legal aid clinic that handles elder financial abuse cases in Western North Carolina. They named a small conference room after her. I cried at the dedication. My sister moved out within the 30 days. She moved in with a friend, and then with a different friend, and then last I heard, into a studio apartment above a bakery. She blocked me on everything. That's fine. My mother stayed in the house. She pays me rent through a property management company that handles all the communication because I'm not interested in the small monthly drama of her trying to negotiate. She started going to therapy in February. She sent me a letter at Easter. It was 3 pages long and I read it once and put it in a drawer. It wasn't a good letter, exactly. But it was a real one. That's something. I sold the house eventually. Not to a stranger. I sold it back to my mother on a long-term seller-financed note at a price she could carry on her widow's-style fixed income. I'm not going to pretend that was generosity. It was something more complicated than that. It was the version of a deal my grandmother might have made if she'd been in my position. It honored the woman she had been. That mattered to me. I went back to work. My firm gave me a bonus the quarter that they did not have to give me, with a card from my managing partner that just said, "Glad you're back." I kept the card. People ask me sometimes when this story comes up at dinner parties why I did it the way I did. Why I didn't just confront them when I first found the evidence. Why I lived in that house for 18 months eating my mother's pot roast and pretending to be unemployed. The honest answer is that I needed to be sure. I needed receipts. I needed the kind of file that wouldn't fall apart in a courtroom. My grandmother had asked me to make sure he never did it to anyone else, and to do that, you can't just be angry. You have to be patient. The other honest answer is that I needed to know who they were. All 3 of them. I needed to know whether my mother, given the chance, would protect me or sell me. I needed to know whether my sister, the favorite, the one whose chocolate fountain we paid for, was someone I could love into being decent. I got my answer the morning the locksmith came. I think about it sometimes, that moment in the hotel conference room. The little red heart on my phone. The locksmith's van in the driveway. The way I felt nothing for 4 seconds and then felt everything. I think about how I closed my laptop and I told myself, very calmly, now we begin. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant when it was all over. I didn't, exactly. I felt something quieter than that. I felt like I had kept a promise to a woman who was no longer alive to see it kept. I felt like I had stopped a bad man from being a bad man for at least the next 4 years. I felt like I had told the truths about my family finally, after 31 years of pretending. I'm sitting in my kitchen as I write this. It's late. The dog my grandmother left me, an ancient terrier named after a poet, is asleep on my foot. The dishwasher is running. Tomorrow I have a deposition in Atlanta and a call with a new client at 2. My life is calm now, in a way it has not been in a very long time. And in a small framed photo on the shelf above my stove, my grandmother is laughing in her garden in 1987, and I swear, on some days I can hear her say, "Good girl. Now eat your dinner." I think about that morning in the Charlotte hotel more than I expected to. The little red heart on my phone. The locksmith's van. The 4 seconds where I felt nothing at all. People who hear this story sometimes ask me if I planned it from the beginning, if I'd always intended to end up owning my parents' mortgage. The truth is, no. I planned to keep a promise to my grandmother. Everything else my father did to me, the locks, the lawn, the pawn shop, those were choices he made on his own, and the consequences he received were not punishments I invented. They were the natural shape of what he had already done coming back to meet him. That's the part I want anyone listening to understand. Cause and effect is a quiet law, and it doesn't care how charming you are at the breakfast table. My father stole from a dying woman for 6 years. He forged my signature on a federal document. He told my mother to tell me to go live in the streets. None of those things happened to him because I was vengeful. They happened because he had already done them, and eventually the documentation caught up to the man. I learned 3 things in that house that I want to say plainly. The first is about character. You can't shortcut it. My grandmother spent her last good months writing me a letter instead of confronting her own son-in-law, because she knew the only way to stop a thief is with proof, and proof takes time, and time takes patience. Patience is not a personality trait. It's a moral muscle. You build it by sitting still when every cell in your body wants to scream. The second is about the mind. I owed my freedom to the boring parts of my education, the bar exam. The years of forensic accounting work, the 1,000 depositions where I learned how to ask the next question, none of that felt heroic when I was doing it. It felt like Tuesday. But when the lock changed at 11:47 on that Tuesday morning, every dull skill I'd ever earned was sitting in my hands, ready. Knowledge is a slow inheritance, and you don't know which piece of it will save you until the day it does. The third is about strength, which is not the same as anger. Anger is what I felt when I saw my reading chair on the curb. Strength is what I used at midnight in a Hampton Inn, eating a sad salad and making a list. Anger burns out. Strength is what's left over when it does. If you are sitting in a hard place right now, in a family that does not see you, in a job that drains you, in a quiet betrayal you haven't named yet, please understand that the way out is not loud. The way out is patient, prepared, and when the moment comes, completely unshakable. I kept my grandmother's promise. I kept my own. Some nights when the dog is asleep on my foot and the house is quiet, that feels like enough.